So that is a bit of a shocker, honestly.
So that was the reaction of Peter Svidler when Hans Niemann played this shocking move. Now, going into round 10 of the Sunway Sitges Open tournament, Hans Niemann was just a half a point behind the leader, Kirill Aleksenko, and they were playing in this final game, so Hans Niemann needed to win with the black pieces to win the whole tournament, and of course Kirill was just hoping for a draw or better. So high quality drama, let's see what happened. So we had e4 on the board, e5 from Hans, now knight f3, knight c6, and bishop c4 starts the Italian game. We had knight f6 played, no knight g5, the fried liver stuff. Instead we get the more modest d3, very solid. And now bishop c5 from Hans, he comes outside the pawn chain after d6 is coming. And now a4 from white. Lots of different moves here. You can really play with the move order. c3 is common, castles, but here we see the queenside expansion, and after d6 from Hans, now we get pawn to c3. So there's a threat here to go b4, a5, trapping that bishop. So a5 was played, gives some room, stops the b4 break. Both players now castle, and now h3, h6 inserted, standard ideas, taking away these squares from the bishops, and also giving the king some Luft, which is the German word for air, in case anyone doesn't know that. Now we had rook e1, common idea. So it covers this e-pawn, protects it, and then supports a later d4. Very standard break for white in these positions. And now Hans goes bishop to e6, another common idea. This is a really powerful unopposed piece right now, so you want to challenge it. And if white takes, it's not such a big deal, because yes, you shatter the pawns, you double them, but in compensation, you support a later d5, you also control this square now, and you open the f-file. So there's enough dynamic play to offset the pawn weakness. So now we had knight b to d2 played instead, preparing to recapture on c4 like this, if black takes. So instead, Hans goes bishop to a7, and this is just a prophylactic move, looking out for the later d4 break. Whoops, can't draw the arrows. And now queen b3 intensifies the pressure both on this bishop and on this pawn. So what do you do about that? Well, queen d7 was played, and actually it sets a trap for white. If you take this pawn, well, the queen's actually getting trapped after you bring the rook, and you can't save it like this. Then we've got the discovered check, and you pick up the queen next move. So you can't take on b7, poisoned pawn. And if you take on e6, by the way, we get the same kind of liquidation, no problems for black. So instead, knight f1 was played. Opens up this bishop. Standard idea as well to try and bring the knight into this square or this square soon, where it can look at some of these light squared weaknesses in the black position. Now bishop takes on c4, and it's a standard kind of idea for Hans to unravel the pieces now. Queen recaptures, and now queen e6 again challenges the powerful piece, and we see the queen ducking away to b5 here, putting more pressure on this pawn, but still it is immune because of the pressure that black would get down the b-file. White still not finished the development, and bishop b6 is a really interesting move. It's not so much about defending that b-pawn, because black gets tons of play if white ever takes it, but it's actually geared up against this bishop e3 move, because now if you do that, looks so natural, you get hit with this knight to a7. And because the queen's got no retreat squares here, it'd have to come to c4, and now you can take, you shatter the pawn structure, and this is basically better for black because you've got these weaknesses to start attacking, not what you want as white. So that's the sneaky trap which bishop b6 sets, and that's why this knight drops back to d2, because now after knight a7 you support the queen b3 retreat, we see captures, and this knight can recapture, this one's still poised to support bishop e3 or the knight coming to e3, etc. And now when this knight hops back, its job is done on a7. Well, here's an interesting moment, because bishop e3 really just shuts down any kind of life in the game, because after Hans captures, I mean, that's not forced, you could go knight d7, but those bishops are coming off the board. Well, now we can see everything's symmetrical, same pair of minor pieces, difficult for Hans to drum up chances. Oh, and also from here, there's no d5 break. But what we see in the game is the knight coming to e3. and Hans now chops that one off, bishop recaptures and goes pawn d5. So in a must-win game for the tournament, suddenly white's created an imbalance with the minor pieces and Hans gets a pawn break. So now it's hotting up. f3 on the board protects that central pawn, and now the rook centralized on the d file. We see bishop f2 opening the eyes of this rook. This one came to the e file. This one now centralized, and now b6 from Hans, good move, takes away c5 from any minor pieces, and rook d2 played. More good prophylactic chess, preparing to double on one of the files. And now after rook e6, also preparing to double, again Kirill just goes slightly wrong here. So a good move, for example, is king f1. You just hold off. And now if black tries to double or take the pawn and then double, well, you can challenge the file. You've got this kind of thing. We see this in the game. But what happens in the game was the rook comes to e2, doubling on the e file. But now when Hans captures, pawn recaptures, he doubles on the only open file on the board and it can't be challenged. So again, he's got another trump. So g3 played. And now the knight comes to e8. Its journey's been shut down from here into the dark squares, so it goes on a different one. King g2, and now the rook nudges back, clearing the room for the knight to come to d6. Bishop back to e3, looks at this key square. Knight d6, eyes c4, and the top move here for white is to actually cover that knight jump, and the game could go on something like this. Hans can carry on improving. He's the one with the slight edge here, but instead we see the rook coming to the d file, and now after knight c4 we see an exchange, and this is perhaps why white played like this, to get some pieces off the board, and now the bishop drops back to cover this pawn. So knight d8 now played. That knight was going nowhere from c6, no jumps, so it's re-maneuvering. Knight d2 challenges this piece. Hans again drops back. He wants to keep the tension here. The knight came back to b3, and now knight e6 was followed by rook d2, finally challenging that file, and so Hans brings his king to come and protect this unprotected rook. Rook d5 played, hits this pawn, f6 covers, king f1, king e7, king e2, and now g5 is a great clamping move, and there's again a kind of positional threat here where we can see the knights are kind of outplaying this knight and bishop combo. So g5's now preparing to go pawn h5, pawn h4, and then if that one has to capture or get captured, whatever it might be, you free up this f4 square for a knight hop. So some dangerous ideas in the air for white. Now we had bishop e3, knight c4 hit the bishop, and now takes on d7, king recaptures, the bishop drops back, and the king marches to c6. And this is the other dangerous thing, is that Hans got this b5 break here, then he can start marching in with the king. And so that's why here the knight drops back to a1, important move, so that now if you go b5, which we didn't see in the game, you can capture, king captures, and because the knight's retreated, you've got time for b3, kicking this one out, and then knight c2. And you formed this barrier with the pawns, plus the bishop can maybe come here, try and chop a knight. Okay, game goes on, black still got the edge, but this is an important kind of setup if b5 was played. Sorry, that's my kitchen sink going off. Okay, so we had h5 on the board instead, and now b4 from white. Now you could go b3. This is the more responsibly positional move because you don't give up this d4 square. And after you drive this knight back, then you go bishop a3. Now h4 can still come. This whole idea of challenging the pawn, knight f4. Black still for choice, but this was technically best. But what we see after b4 is captures, pawn recaptures, and now you've given up this d4 square. Things are getting very dangerous for white. So the king came to d3. It abandons this pawn, but it does counterattack this knight. That's why b5 was played. And now there's problems here for white, because how do you actually defend this pawn? Now here the computer just wants to ditch the f-pawn, push a5, and try and get some counterplay going with knight b3 to c5, push a6. but it should never be enough, especially because one of these pawns is also going to drop in a moment. But what we had in the game was pawn to f4 here. Much more human move, saving that pawn, and this is where Hans plays his shocking decision. So he just immediately blitzes out, takes on f4, but look at his clock. He's got 47 minutes to consider this in a must-win game. Now, if he'd taken some time here, he would have seen how powerful e takes on f4 is. Now, it's not easy to see at first because you're giving an entire knight if white wants to take it. But the idea is that then you take on g3. Now, this is about to queen, so you have to cover with the bishop. And then there's this h4 move, locking down this pawn, threat to go g4, and it's just unstoppable when the minor pieces are stuck over this side of the board. So knight c2 is one of the best moves here. Then you go g4, threat to take here, so white has to capture, and now you push this pawn. And you just can't stop it going through. This is the problem. Really nice idea. And if white doesn't take the knight on d4, say they just recapture, well, same idea, pawn to g4, you have to take here or else we're going to capture, run it through, and then we don't capture back like this, instead we run the pawn. Now f4 is forced to cover this with the bishop, but then you push, bishop f4, knight f3, and you're actually forcing h2, picking up a bishop for knight, and that endgame should be lost a minor piece up. So really nice winning ideas here for Hans, but he blitzes this one out, pawn recaptures, and suddenly it's not so easy to force the win. He goes knight f3, and this looks really dangerous, winning this pawn, but knight c2 now comes out of the corner, knight g1 goes for the pawn, and here Kirill doesn't even save the pawn, he plays knight to e3. Really nice idea. Now Hans retreats this knight, but if he captures, then the idea is that after the bishop takes and the knight picks up a pawn, even though black's a pawn up, after takes, pawn a5, the problem here is that white's getting a lot of counterplay with this passed pawn, and the king is now going to march round and corral this pawn, pressure the knight, plus this knight's actually pretty stuck right now. Its only jump is into f4, where white's got the option to chop it off, and then again use the king coming over here, plus then white would have two passed pawns, and black would have to be careful. So this is why it gives enough play. Hans retreated the knight, coming here was actually best, but okay, he comes here, and now we see takes on e5, pawn recaptures, and a5 kicks this knight once again. Now again, this was the best square. Hans jumps here, and now it's literally stuck out on the rim, hasn't actually got any jumps. Really dodgy looking piece and position for black now. And here Hans, he actually offered a draw, and of course Kirill accepted it to outright win the tournament. So a fascinating struggle there. Hans just missed his chance, but he has broken into the 2700 club in this tournament firmly. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Congratulations to Kirill, of course. Now I'm going to take a few days off with Christmas and everything coming up, but I'll be back on the 26th when we've got day one of the Rapid and Blitz, Magnus, Hikaru, Hans, all in action, mouth-watering contest. So do hit subscribe to never miss a future recap, and I hope you have a great Christmas if you're celebrating it, and I'll see you again soon.